Maylin's fingers hovered over the piano keys in the practice room, tucked away in the far corner of the Westfield Academy of Music. Outside the small window, raindrops tapped against the glass, creating their own melody. It was nearly midnight, the only time she could secure a room without being asked to leave for someone more important. The academy halls were mostly empty now. A few dedicated students still wandered about, their footsteps echoing in the marble corridors. But no one noticed the light from under her door, or the soft notes that occasionally escaped when she tested a difficult passage. May adjusted her posture on the bench and placed her fingers on the keys. The piano was old, slightly out of tune on the highest notes, but it was better than the digital keyboard in her tiny apartment, where she practiced with headphones to avoid disturbing her roommate. She began playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Her small hands stretched to reach the intervals, moving with a grace that contradicted her otherwise awkward demeanor. When she played, something inside her transformed. Her normally hunched shoulders relaxed, her perpetual worried expression smoothed, and her breathing deepened. No one at Westfield knew about this transformation. To them, she was just the quiet girl who sat in the back of theory class, who ate lunch alone at the corner table in the cafeteria, whose name professors consistently mispronounced on the rare occasions they called on her. "You need to project yourself more," her advisor had told her during their brief semester meeting. "This is a competitive field. You can't expect opportunities to fall into your lap." He'd barely looked up from her file as he spoke, his eyes already moving to the next student's information. May had nodded, murmured a quiet, "Yes, sir," and left his office knowing nothing would change. She'd never been good at drawing attention to herself. Back home in her small town, her middle school music teacher had been the only one who noticed her talent, who encouraged her to apply for the scholarship that eventually brought her here. The memory made her fingers press harder on the keys, the nocturne suddenly louder than she intended. She immediately softened her touch, glancing nervously at the door, though she knew no one would complain. No one complained about things they didn't notice. Finishing the piece, she flipped through her music folder and pulled out a sonata she needed to perfect for her upcoming evaluation. Her professors wouldn't be impressed, they never were, but she couldn't bear the thought of playing poorly. Music was the one thing she had, even if no one else recognized it. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight as she began practicing the challenging first movement. Down the hall, the janitor pushed his cart, pausing briefly by her door before continuing on. He'd seen her here many nights but never interrupted. Some evenings he left a bottle of water or a granola bar outside her door, small kindnesses that meant more to May than he could know. Morning came too quickly. May rubbed her eyes as sunlight streamed through the window of the theory classroom. She'd stayed at the practice room until 3, then caught a few hours of sleep before her 8 a.m. class. Professor Winters paced at the front of the room, his booming voice discussing the intricacies of counterpoint. His gaze swept over the students, lingering on those who had established themselves as talented, promising, worth watching. His eyes skipped over May as if the seat she occupied was empty. Next to her, 2 students whispered about an upcoming recital. "Did you get selected?" one asked. "Of course," the other replied, not bothering to lower his voice. "Lin Chang is the only one from our year who didn't make the cut." May kept her eyes on her notebook, pretending not to hear her own name mangled yet again. She'd submitted her application for the recital like everyone else, even included a recording of her playing Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. The rejection email had been brief, impersonal. The class ended, and students flowed into the hallway, forming natural groups as they headed to practice rooms or the cafeteria. May walked alone, clutching her books to her chest, stepping carefully to avoid colliding with anyone. People brushed past her without seeing. Conversations continued without including her. In the cafeteria, she sat at her usual corner table. The chair across from her remained empty as students chose to stand rather than join her. She unwrapped her simple sandwich and opened a theory book, using lunch to study as she always did. "Attention, everyone." A tall man in a crisp suit stood in the center of the cafeteria, his voice cutting through the chatter. It was Dean Hartford, the Academy's administrator, who typically only appeared for special announcements. The room quieted immediately. Even May looked up from her book. "As you know, our annual winter showcase is approaching. This year, we're honored to have representatives from the National Symphony Orchestra and the Riverside Philharmonic attending. He paused as excited whispers broke out. These are career-making opportunities, so I expect all featured performers to be practicing diligently. May's heart sank. More opportunities she wouldn't be considered for. More chances for her classmates to step further into the spotlight, while she remained in the shadows. After lunch, she had her weekly private lesson with Professor Chen. Unlike most faculty, Professor Chen at least seemed to remember her name, though his perpetual disappointment in her performance made these sessions an exercise in humiliation. "Your technique is adequate," he said after she finished playing a Bach prelude. "But where is the emotion? Where is your interpretation? You play like a well-programmed computer." May nodded, accepting the criticism without defense. How could she explain that the emotion was there, buried deep where no one could see it? That she felt every note with an intensity that frightened her sometimes? "Perhaps music performance is not your path," Professor Chen continued, checking his watch. "Have you considered music education instead? Or arts administration?" The suggestion stung worse than outright criticism. He was telling her to give up on her dream, to accept that she didn't have what it took. "I'll work harder," she promised, the same response she always gave. He sighed. "See that you do. Next week I want to hear the Mozart Sonata. All movements." After the lesson, May headed to the library. Not the main library where students gathered to study and socialize, but the small archives section in the basement, where ancient scores and music histories gathered dust. Here at least she could be alone without feeling lonely. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Wu, looked up as May entered. Unlike most people at the academy, Mrs. Wu always had a smile for her. "Back again? You spend more time here than anyone." May managed a small smile in return. "It's quiet here. Too quiet, if you ask me. A young woman should be out there making music, making friends." May shrugged and headed to her favorite corner, where a small desk sat beneath a window that showed a ground-level view of people's feet walking by outside. She pulled out her theory homework, but found herself instead opening her notebook to a blank page. Almost without conscious thought, she began to write. Not words, but music, fragments of melodies that had been floating in her head for weeks. She rarely showed these compositions to anyone. Once in her first year, she'd timidly offered one to her composition professor. He'd glanced at it for mere seconds before handing it back with a dismissive derivative. The hours slipped by as she worked, lost in the world of her own creation. When she finally looked up, the library was nearly dark and Mrs. Wu was putting on her coat. "Closing time, dear," the librarian called. "Whatever has you so absorbed can wait until tomorrow." May gathered her things, surprised to find that her stomach was growling. She'd missed dinner entirely. Outside, the campus was quiet. Most students would be in evening rehearsals or out in the city enjoying the nightlife. A few windows in the practice building still glowed with light, the dedicated few working late like her. Her roommate Zoe was out when May returned to their apartment. A note on the counter read, "Party at Blake's, don't wait up." As if May ever did. Zoe, a vivacious flute player who had never wanted a roommate, treated their shared space as essentially her own, tolerating May's presence with barely concealed impatience. May made herself a cup of noodles and sat at their small kitchen table. On the refrigerator, held by magnets, were numerous invitations and flyers, all addressed to Zoe. Recitals, parties, special masterclasses. A whole world of musical opportunity that seemed to exist in a parallel universe from May's own. She finished her modest dinner and went to her room, the smaller of the two bedrooms, barely large enough for a twin bed and desk. Her digital piano keyboard sat on the desk, headphones neatly coiled beside it. May put on the headphones and began to play softly, the weighted keys a poor substitute for a real piano but better than nothing. As her fingers moved, she let her mind wander, imagining what it would be like to play on a real stage, with people actually listening, actually seeing her. The fantasy was so foreign it almost made her laugh. The girl no one noticed, suddenly the center of attention? It seemed as impossible as flying. And yet, as she played into the night, a small, persistent voice inside her whispered that somewhere, somehow, there must be a way to make them hear her. Not just the notes she played, but the music that lived inside her heart, the music that was her true voice in a world that had never bothered to listen. The archives room in the basement of Westfield Academy's library had become May's sanctuary over the past 2 years. While other students avoided the dusty shelves and flickering fluorescent lights, she found comfort in the silence and the company of forgotten musical treasures. This Wednesday afternoon, May had a rare 2-hour break between classes. Professor Klein had canceled their advanced theory lecture to attend a symphony performance, and most students had scattered to practice rooms or coffee shops. May headed straight to the archives. Back again so soon? Mrs. Wu looked up from her ancient computer, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. You were just here yesterday. I need to research for my music history paper, May explained, clutching her notebook. The one about overlooked romantic-era composers. Mrs. Wu smiled knowingly. Finding kindred spirits among the forgotten, are we? Before May could respond, the librarian continued. There's a new collection that might interest you. Some old manuscripts were donated last month from the estate of a former professor. I've only just finished cataloging them. She pointed to a cart of materials waiting to be shelved. Box on the bottom. Mostly sheet music from the 1800s. Not particularly valuable, but perhaps useful for your paper. May thanked her and wheeled the cart to her usual corner. The box was heavier than it looked, filled with yellowed papers and folders and loose sheets protected by plastic sleeves. She carefully lifted out the contents, arranging them on the desk. Most were exactly what Mrs. Wu had described, unremarkable compositions by minor composers, study pieces and simplified arrangements of popular works from the era. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in brown paper and tied with faded ribbon, was a bound manuscript that looked different from the rest. May carefully untied the ribbon, feeling oddly nervous as she unwrapped the package. Inside was a leather-bound collection of sheet music, the cover embossed with gold lettering so worn she could barely make out the title, Nocturnes and Reveries by T.H. She opened to the first page, where someone had written in fading ink, Property of Thomas Harwell, 1863. The name meant nothing to May, clearly not one of the composers covered in her music history classes. As she turned the brittle pages, her heartbeat quickened. The compositions were unlike anything she'd seen before. They used conventional notation, yes, but with unusual markings in the margins, symbols she didn't recognize, written in the same faded ink as the owner's name. The harmonic progressions were strange too, seeming to break rules that wouldn't be challenged until decades later. May glanced around, though she knew no one else was in the archives. She felt like she'd discovered something private, something not meant for casual examination. Her fingers itched to try the notes to hear how these unusual combinations would sound. She checked her watch. Still an hour before her next class. Enough time to photograph a few pages with her phone and perhaps try them later on the practice room piano. Find something interesting? Mrs. Wu appeared suddenly beside her, making May jump. Yes, she admitted, unable to hide her excitement. This collection, do you know anything about Thomas Harwell? Mrs. Wu shook her head. The name doesn't ring a bell. Was he the composer? I'm not sure. May pointed to the strange markings. I've never seen notations like these. The librarian peered over her shoulder. Curious indeed. Perhaps personal shorthand? Some composers developed their own systems for performance notes. Do you think? May hesitated, then gathered her courage. Would it be possible for me to borrow this? Just for a week or so? I'd be extremely careful with it. Mrs. Wu considered this, looking from the manuscript to May's hopeful face. Technically, these materials shouldn't leave the archives, but she glanced toward her desk where no one waited for assistance. You've proven yourself trustworthy. Sign it out as research material for your paper, and I'll make an exception. 1 week only. May could hardly believe her luck. Thank you. I promise I'll take perfect care of it. See that you do. And May? Mrs. Wu's eyes twinkled behind her glasses. If you discover anything remarkable about this mystery composer, I'd love to hear about it. With a manuscript carefully tucked into her backpack, May hurried to her next class, her mind already swimming with the strange harmonies she'd glimpsed. The afternoon dragged as she sat through a lecture on orchestration techniques, her thoughts repeatedly drifting to the mysterious collection. When classes finally ended, she practically ran to the practice building. It was the busiest time of day, with every room usually occupied. But May knew of one room, small with a slightly out-of-tune upright piano, that most students avoided. To her relief, it was empty. She closed the door, set up her phone to record, and carefully placed the first page of Thomas Harwell's Nocturnes on the piano stand. Taking a deep breath, she began to play, The opening notes were simple enough, a gentle melody in a minor that reminded her a bit of Chopin. But as she continued, the piece transformed. Dissonances appeared where she least expected them, resolving in ways that sent shivers down her spine. The rhythm shifted subtly, creating a dreamlike quality that made her forget she was in a tiny practice room with poor acoustics. When she reached the strange markings, May hesitated. What had the composer intended? After a moment's consideration, she decided to interpret them as emotional directions rather than technical ones. Where the symbol appeared like a spiral, she let the notes swirl with increasing intensity. Where it resembled a sunburst, she brightened the tone, bringing light to the phrase. She finished the first piece and sat in silence, her hands still resting on the keys. Something had happened while she played, something she couldn't quite explain. It was as if the music had reached inside her and rearranged something, opening a door she hadn't known existed. Without hesitation, she turned to the next piece in the collection. This one was darker, with an underlying current of tension that built throughout. The strange symbols appeared more frequently here, and May followed her instincts, letting them guide her interpretation. Time slipped away as she played through the collection. The sun had set, casting the practice room into shadow, but she barely noticed. She was lost in Thomas Harwell's world, a world of unexpected beauty and emotional depth that spoke to her as if it had been written for her alone. A knock on the door startled her back to reality. She looked up to see a janitor peering in. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I need to lock up this wing soon." "It's past 9. May blinked in surprise. She'd been playing for over 4 hours without realizing it. "I'm sorry, I lost track of time." He smiled kindly. "No problem. Sounded real nice, whatever it was." She gathered her things quickly, carefully returning the manuscript to her backpack. As she walked back to her apartment in the cool evening air, May felt different somehow, lighter, as if some of the weight she'd been carrying had lifted. Her roommate Zoe was home when she arrived, lounging on the couch with her laptop. "Where have you been?" Zoe asked, not looking up from her screen. "You're never out this late." "Practicing," May replied, surprised that Zoe had noticed her absence at all. "Well, some guy called for you. From the music department office, I think." Zoe waved vaguely toward a notepad by the phone. "Left a message." May picked up the pad, her heart sinking as she read the note. It was about her upcoming evaluation performance. They'd moved it up by 2 weeks. Instead of next month, she would be playing for the faculty panel this Friday. Panic rose in her chest. She wasn't ready. The Beethoven sonata still needed work, and the Bach prelude and fugue were nowhere near performance level. She'd been counting on those extra 2 weeks. She went to her room and sat heavily on the bed, the manuscript still in her backpack. On impulse, she took it out again, running her fingers over the leather cover. Maybe it was crazy, but part of her wanted to play one of these pieces for her evaluation instead of the standard repertoire. The thought was terrifying. The faculty expected certain pieces, certain interpretations. Presenting an unknown work by an obscure composer would be risky at best, career suicide at worst. And yet, May opened the manuscript again, turning to the piece that had affected her most deeply, a nocturne that began with a simple, haunting melody before blossoming into something transcendent. She could still feel it in her fingers, in her heart. For the next 2 days, May lived a double life. In her regular practice sessions, she dutifully worked on her assigned repertoire. But late at night and in every stolen moment between classes, she returned to Thomas Harwell's Nocturne, diving deeper into its mysteries, experimenting with the strange notations, refining her interpretation. The more she played it, the more she understood it, not intellectually but on some deeper level. The unusual harmonies no longer seemed strange but inevitable, perfect in their unexpectedness. The piece had become a part of her, or perhaps she had become a part of it. On Thursday night, the evening before her evaluation, May sat in her usual practice room long after most students had gone home. Her official repertoire was as ready as it would ever be, competent but uninspired, just like all her previous performances. The manuscript lay closed on top of the piano. She had practically memorized the nocturne by now, could play it with her eyes closed, feeling her way through its emotional landscape. May took a deep breath and made her decision. Tomorrow she would play Thomas Harwell's Nocturne for her evaluation. They might fail her for it. They might even ask her to leave the program. But for once in her life, she would play something that mattered to her, something that made her feel alive. As she packed up her music and prepared to leave, a strange calm settled over her. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would finally be seen, not as the quiet, forgettable girl who sat in the back row, but as a musician with something genuine to say. May woke before her alarm on Friday morning, her heart racing as if she'd been running in her sleep. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of her bedroom, casting a golden glow on the leather-bound manuscript that sat on her desk. She'd fallen asleep looking at it, trying to gather courage for what lay ahead. The faculty evaluation was scheduled for 2 p.m. in Thornton Hall, the Academy's premier performance space. With its gleaming grand piano and perfect acoustics, most students would give anything for a chance to play there. May had always performed her evaluations in the smaller recital rooms, where fewer faculty attended and the pressure felt slightly less crushing. She didn't know why they'd moved her to Thornton Hall or bumped up her evaluation date. Perhaps there had been a scheduling error. Or maybe, after 2 years of mediocre reviews, they wanted to make her failure more official, more public. May slipped out of bed and went through her morning routine mechanically, her mind elsewhere. She made a slice of toast but couldn't eat it, her stomach tied in knots. Instead, she sat at her digital keyboard with headphones, running through Thomas Harwell's Nocturne one more time. Her fingers knew the piece now, could find the notes without conscious thought, but she still worried about the strange notations, about whether her interpretation captured what the composer had intended. At 10 a.m., she packed her bag with the manuscript and a bottle of water, then headed to campus, hoping to secure a practice room for one final rehearsal before the evaluation. The practice building was unusually busy for a Friday morning. As May approached, she saw a crowd of students gathered in the lobby, buzzing with excitement. She tried to slip past them unnoticed, but a hand caught her arm. "Did you hear?" It was Li Wei, a cellist from her theory class, one of the few students who occasionally acknowledged her existence. "There are scouts from the National Symphony here today, and someone from the Riverside Philharmonic too." May's blood ran cold. Today, why? For the winter showcase auditions, I guess. But rumor has it they're sitting in on some evaluations too. Li Wei's eyes shone with excitement. Imagine getting spotted during an evaluation. Talk about lucky timing. Lucky wasn't the word May would have chosen. Terrifying seemed more appropriate. Playing an unknown piece by an obscure composer was risky enough for a regular faculty evaluation. Doing it in front of professional orchestra scouts was something else entirely. "Thanks for telling me," she managed, pulling away from Li Wei's grip. "I need to practice now. Good luck." He called after her, already turning back to the excited crowd. All the practice rooms were taken. May wandered the hallways in growing desperation, checking each door only to find someone already inside. As a last resort, she tried the basement level, where the older, out-of-tune pianos were housed in rooms with poor lighting and worse ventilation. To her relief, she found an empty room at the end of the corridor. The piano was a battered upright with yellowed keys and a slightly sticky pedal, but it would have to do. She set up her music, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first few notes came out tentative, shaky. May stopped, closed her eyes, and tried to recapture the feeling she'd had when she first discovered the piece, that sense of connection, of recognition. She began again, and this time the music flowed more naturally. She was so absorbed in the piece that she didn't notice the door opening, didn't realize anyone was listening until she finished the final gentle chord and heard a voice behind her. That was quite unusual. May whirled around to see Professor Chen standing in the doorway, a folder tucked under his arm, his expression unreadable. "Professor!" "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you come in." May scrambled to gather her music to hide the manuscript, but it was too late. "What is that piece?" he asked, stepping into the room. "I don't recognize it." May hesitated, then decided honesty was her only option. "It's a nocturne by Thomas Harwell. I found it in the archives. I was thinking of playing it for my evaluation today." Professor Chen's eyebrows rose. "Instead of the Beethoven and Bach we discussed." "Yes." May clutched the manuscript to her chest, suddenly defensive. "It's a remarkable piece. The harmonies are innovative for its time, and the emotional range is—" "May I see it?" He held out his hand, and reluctantly May passed him the manuscript. He flipped through it with a practiced eye, his frown deepening as he examined the strange notations. "And you've deciphered these markings?" "I've interpreted them, yes." as emotional directives rather than technical ones. He handed the manuscript back to her. It's certainly unconventional, and quite challenging from what I heard. He paused, studying her face. You've never shown such conviction in your playing before. May didn't know how to respond to that. Was it a compliment or criticism? Your evaluation is in 3 hours, Professor Chen continued. You're prepared to take this risk? To play a piece no one knows by a composer no one has heard of? Yes, May said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. I am, he nodded slowly. Very well. It's your evaluation. He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. Oh, and May? There will be guests at your evaluation today. Important ones. Just so you're aware. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving May alone with her chosen piece and a growing sense of dread mixed with strange exhilaration. The hours passed both too quickly and too slowly. May practiced until her fingers ached, then forced herself to stop. Knowing she needed to conserve her energy, she ate a small lunch in a quiet corner of the cafeteria, avoiding the excited chatter about the orchestra scouts. Then she changed into her performance. Clothes, a simple black dress she'd worn for every recital and evaluation since her first year, and made her way to Thornton Hall. The B. Grand foyer was busy with students and faculty coming and going. A sign by the main hall listed the day's evaluations. May's name was there, sandwiched between two of the academy's star pupils. Her stomach lurched at the sight. She found a bench in a quiet alcove and sat down, closing her eyes and trying to steady her breathing. In her mind, she went through the piece one more time, feeling the rise and fall of the phrases, the unexpected turns of harmony, the places where the music seemed to open up into something transcendent. Miss Lin, a student worker, approached her, clipboard in hand. They're ready for you now. May nodded, gathered her music, and followed the young man to the stage door. He gave her an encouraging smile as he opened it for her. Break a leg. The stage of Thornton Hall was larger than any May had performed on before. The gleaming black grand piano sat in the center, lid fully open, bathed in warm spotlights. Beyond it, the hall stretched into shadow, but May could make out figures sitting in the first few rows. The evaluation committee, and presumably the visitors from the orchestras. She walked to the piano, her footsteps echoing in the hushed space. As she settled on the bench and arranged her music, she heard whispers from the audience, the rustle of papers. Someone coughed. Miss Lin, Dean Hartford's voice came from the darkness. We understand you're prepared to play a Beethoven sonata and a Bach prelude and fugue today. May's hands trembled slightly as she placed them in her lap. With respect, sir, I've prepared a different piece. A nocturne by Thomas Harwell, an American composer from the mid-19th century. More whispers from the audience. Dean Hartford cleared his throat. This is highly irregular, Miss Lin. Evaluations are meant to assess your progress on the standard repertoire. I understand. Sir. May was amazed at how steady her voice sounded when her insides were quaking. But I believe this piece better demonstrates my abilities as a pianist and interpreter. A long pause followed. Me stared at the keys, afraid to look up, certain she had made a terrible mistake. Then a different voice spoke. Professor Chen's. I had the opportunity to hear Miss Lin rehearsing this piece earlier today. It's certainly an interesting choice. Perhaps we should allow her to proceed. May glanced up in surprise, just in time to see Dean Hartford shrug. Very well. You may begin, Miss Lin. She took a deep breath, positioned her hands over the keys, and began to play. The opening notes were tentative, just as they had been in the practice room earlier. But then something shifted. Perhaps it was the perfect action of the grand piano so responsive to her touch. Perhaps it was the way the hall seemed to embrace the sound, giving it depth and resonance. Or perhaps it was simply that in this moment, May had nothing left to lose. Whatever the reason, the music began to flow through her in a way it never had before. The simple opening melody sang with a clarity that carried to every corner of the hall. When the harmonies shifted into unexpected territory, she leaned into the dissonances, letting them create tension before resolving in ways that felt both surprising and inevitable. As she reached the sections with Thomas Harwell's strange notations, May forgot about the audience, forgot about the evaluation, forgot about everything except the conversation she was having with this long-dead composer, whose music spoke so directly to her heart. The spiral marking became a passage of increasing intensity that made her sway on the bench, The sunburst notation transformed into a moment of such radiance that May felt tears spring to her eyes as she played it. Time seemed to both stretch and compress. The piece wasn't particularly long, perhaps 7 minutes, but in those minutes May lived a lifetime of emotions. Joy and sorrow, longing and fulfillment, doubt and certainty all flowed through her fingers into the piano and out into the hall. When she reached the final gentle chord, she let it hang in the air, her hands floating above the keys as the sound diminished to silence. For a moment she remained perfectly still, eyes closed, unwilling to break the spell. Then she heard it, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the audience, followed by complete silence. Not the polite silence of people waiting for a student to leave the stage, but the stunned silence of people who had witnessed something unexpected, something that had left them momentarily speechless. May opened her eyes and carefully lowered her hands to her lap. The hall remained silent for several heartbeats more. Then from the back of the room someone began to clap. The single pair of hands clapping at the back of the hall was quickly joined by another, then another, until the entire room filled with applause. It wasn't the polite, measured clapping that usually followed student evaluations. This was enthusiastic, spontaneous, the kind of response reserved for professional concerts. May sat frozen on the bench, her hands still in her lap, unsure what to do. No one had ever applauded like this for her before. She glanced toward the darkened audience, where she could now make out faces, faculty members leaning forward in their seats, whispering to each other, a few people she didn't recognize nodding with approval. Dean Hartford stood up, raising his hands for quiet. The applause gradually subsided, though a murmur of conversation continued. "Well," he said, looking somewhat flustered. "That was certainly unexpected." He consulted his notes. "You said this was by Thomas Harwell? I'm not familiar with the composer, nor am I," added Professor Winters, the head of the piano department. "Where did you discover this piece, Miss Lynn?" May cleared her throat, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. "In the Academy archives, sir. It's part of a collection that was recently donated. Mrs. Wu in the library helped me find it." A woman May didn't recognize rose from her seat in the front row and approached the stage. She was elegantly dressed in a tailored suit, her silver hair cut in a stylish bob. "May I see the manuscript?" she asked, her voice carrying authority. Dean Hartford made a quick introduction. "Miss Lynn, this is Dr. Eleanor Powell, director of the Riverside Philharmonic." May's hands trembled slightly as she handed the leather-bound manuscript to Dr. Powell, who examined it with the careful attention of someone who had handled many rare scores. "Fascinating," Dr. Powell murmured, turning the pages slowly. "These notations? Quite unusual for the period." She looked up at May. "And how did you interpret these markings?" I treated them as emotional directives," May explained, finding her voice growing stronger as she talked about the music. "The spiral seemed to indicate building intensity, and the sunburst, that's what I call it, suggested a kind of illumination or revelation." Dr. Powell nodded thoughtfully. "A reasonable approach, and your interpretation was—" She paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Compelling." "Indeed it was," added a deep voice from the audience. A tall man with a salt and pepper beard stood up. "Rick Patterson, National Symphony. Miss Lynn, you played with remarkable conviction. I'm curious, how long have you been working on this piece?" "Just a few days," May admitted, surprised by the question. Eyebrows shot up around the room. Professor Chen leaned forward. "A few days? You've achieved this level of interpretation in just a few days?" May nodded, uncertain whether she'd said something wrong. Dr. Powell handed the manuscript back to May with a small smile. "Well, you've certainly given us something to think about, Miss Lynn. Thank you for your unorthodox performance." Dean Hartford cleared his throat again. "Yes, well, the committee will discuss your evaluation, and you'll receive our feedback next week as usual." "You may go now, Miss Lynn." May gathered her music and stood, bowing slightly before walking off the stage. Her legs felt wobbly, her mind spinning with the unexpected reaction to her performance. As she pushed through the stage door back into the foyer, she nearly collided with the next student waiting to perform. "Sorry," she mumbled, stepping aside. The student, a confident pianist named Tao who had won several competitions, gave her a curious look. "What happened in there?" "That was a lot of applause for an evaluation." "I'm not sure," May said honestly, still trying to process it herself. Tao looked like he wanted to ask more questions. But the student worker with the clipboard appeared and ushered him toward the stage door. "They're ready for you now." May walked slowly through the foyer, feeling strangely disconnected from her surroundings. She had expected her risky choice to result in criticism or even failure. The enthusiastic response had caught her completely off guard. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright, making her blink after the dimness of the concert hall. She stood on the steps for a moment, clutching the manuscript to her chest, trying to decide what to do next. Part of her wanted to run back to her apartment and hide until she received her official evaluation. Another part wanted to return to a practice room and play the nocturne again, to recapture the magical feeling she'd experienced on stage. Before she could decide, the door behind her opened and Dr. Powell emerged, accompanied by Dean Hartford and Mr. Patterson from the National Symphony. "Ah, Miss Lynn, I was hoping to catch you," Dr. Powell said, coming down the steps to join her. "I wonder if you might have time for a coffee. I have some questions about that remarkable piece you played." May stared at her in surprise. "Me? You want to have coffee with me?" Dr. Powell smiled. "Yes, you. Unless you have another commitment right now?" No commitment," May said quickly. "I'm free." "Excellent." Dr. Powell turned to the men. "Gentlemen, would you care to join us?" Dean Hartford checked his watch. "I'm afraid I have to get back for the next evaluation. But perhaps we could meet later to discuss." "Of course," Dr. Powell said smoothly. "Rick?" Mr. Patterson nodded. "I'd be delighted. I'm quite intrigued by what we just heard." And so, in a daze, May found herself walking across campus between two of the most influential people in the classical music world. Heading to the coffee shop where she usually sat alone in the corner, unnoticed by everyone. The barista did a double-take when May approached the counter with her distinguished companions. May usually ordered the cheapest item on the menu, a simple black coffee that she would nurse for hours while studying. Today, Dr. Powell insisted on paying for her drink and a pastry as well. They settled at a table by the window, the manuscript placed carefully in the center like a precious artifact, which May was beginning to realize it might actually be. "Tell me," Dr. Powell began, stirring her tea. "How did you come to choose this particular piece, out of all the compositions in the archives? What drew you to this one?" May considered the question. "Honestly, it was partly chance. Mrs. Wu pointed me to a newly cataloged collection, and this was at the bottom of the box." She hesitated, then decided to speak frankly. "But when I first played it, something just connected, like the music was waiting for someone to find it." Instead of looking skeptical at such a fanciful notion, both Dr. Powell and Mr. Patterson nodded in understanding. "The best musical discoveries often feel that way," Mr. Patterson said, "as if the composer reached across time specifically to you." He leaned forward, examining the manuscript without touching it. "These notations are extraordinary. They suggest Harwell was experimenting with emotional expression in a way that was decades ahead of his time." "What do you know about him?" Dr. Powell asked. "This Thomas Harwell? Almost nothing," May admitted. "Just his name and the date, 1863. I searched for information but couldn't find anything about him in the Academy's resources." "Not surprising," Dr. Powell mused. "Many talented composers from that period have been forgotten by history, especially if they weren't affiliated with major institutions or didn't publish widely." She took a sip of her tea. "With your permission, I'd like to have our archivists look into this. The Riverside has extensive historical records that might tell us more about Harwell." May nodded eagerly. "Of course. I'd love to know more about him. And I'd like to hear the rest of the compositions in that collection," Mr. Patterson added, "if they're all of this quality." He left the thought unfinished, but his expression was one of excitement. "Have you performed publicly before, Miss Lynn?" Dr. Powell asked, changing the subject slightly. May shook her head. "Only student recitals and evaluations, and not in major venues like Thornton Hall until today." "That's surprising," Mr. Patterson remarked. "You play with unusual sensitivity. I would have expected you to be featured in the Academy's showcase events." May felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. I've never been selected for those opportunities." Dr. Powell and Mr. Patterson exchanged a glance that May couldn't quite interpret. "Well," Dr. Powell said after a moment, "sometimes remarkable talents go unnoticed until the right piece comes along." She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to May. The Riverside is hosting a special concert next month, a celebration of American composers. We'd originally planned to feature works by Copland and Barber, but I think our audience would be fascinated by a rediscovered piece from the 19th century. May stared at the card, not quite understanding what was being implied. Mr. Patterson leaned forward. Dr. Powell is too subtle. She's inviting you to perform, Miss Lynn. Me? May's voice came out as a squeak. Perform with the Riverside Philharmonic? As a featured soloist, Dr. Powell confirmed with a smile. This nocturne would make a perfect centerpiece for the second half of the program. Of course, we'd need to prepare an orchestral arrangement to accompany you, but our resident composer could work with you on that. May's mind reeled. This morning, she had been a forgettable student preparing for an evaluation she expected to fail. Now she was being offered a professional debut with one of the country's most respected orchestras. I don't know what to say, she stammered. Say yes, Mr. Patterson suggested with a kind smile. Opportunities like this don't come along every day. But I'm not ready, May protested weakly. I'm just a student. A student who silenced a room full of jaded music professionals with a single performance, Dr. Powell pointed out. Trust me, Miss Lynn, you're ready. This piece speaks through you in a way that can't be taught. May looked down at the manuscript, at the faded ink and strange symbols that had somehow changed the course of her life in just a few days. She thought about all the hours she'd spent practicing alone, unnoticed and unappreciated. She thought about the quiet voice inside that had always believed she had something worth saying through music, if only someone would listen. Yes, she said finally, looking up with new confidence. I'll do it. As they finished their coffee and discussed the details of the upcoming concert, May noticed other students from the academy glancing at their table, whispering to each other in surprise. A few professors walked by doing double takes when they saw who she was sitting with. For the first time in her life at Westfield Academy, May Lynn was being seen, not as the quiet girl who faded into the background, but as a musician whose talent commanded attention, and all because she had taken a chance on a forgotten piece of music that somehow had been waiting just for her. The month that followed May's evaluation passed in a whirlwind. Word of her extraordinary performance spread quickly through the academy, transforming her overnight from invisible to infamous. Students who had never spoken to her now greeted her in hallways. Professors who had overlooked her for years suddenly remembered her name and stopped to chat about her interesting career development. Most surprising was the change in her roommate Zoe, who now introduced May to friends as my roommate who's soloing with the Riverside Philharmonic. The sudden attention was both flattering and disorienting. May found herself longing for the quiet anonymity she'd known before, even as she embraced the new opportunities coming her way. Dr. Powell had arranged for May to work with the Riverside's composer in residence, a kind but exacting woman named Dr. Abrams, to create an orchestral arrangement of Thomas Harwell's Nocturne. They met 3 times a week in a small studio at the Riverside's rehearsal space, poring over the manuscript together. The challenge, Dr. Abrams explained during their first session, is to enhance the piano part without overwhelming it. Harwell wrote this for solo piano, but I think we can tease out the colors he might have imagined with a full orchestra. May nodded, watching as Dr. Abrams made notes on a large score. What about the special notations? She asked. The ones that aren't standard? Dr. Abrams smiled. That's where you come in. I want you to show me exactly how you interpret each of these markings. Then we'll find ways for the orchestra to support and amplify those interpretations. Meanwhile, Dr. Powell's team of archivists had begun researching Thomas Harwell, digging through historical records to learn more about the mysterious composer. 2 weeks before the concert, Dr. Powell invited May to her office to share their findings. He was quite an interesting character, Dr. Powell said, spreading old newspaper clippings and photocopied letters on her desk. Thomas Henry Harwell, born 1821 in a small town in Pennsylvania, studied briefly in Europe before returning to America at the outbreak of the Civil War. May leaned forward, fascinated to finally put a history to the name. Did he have a successful career? Dr. Powell's expression turned wistful. Not in the conventional sense. He taught piano privately and played organ at a local church, but he never achieved wide recognition. These clippings mention concerts he organized in his community, usually featuring his own compositions, but they never attracted much attention outside his small circle. Then how did his manuscript end up in our academy's archives? That's the interesting part. Dr. Powell picked up a photocopy of a letter. We found correspondence between Harwell and a music professor at Westfield from the 1870s. Apparently, Harwell sent his compositions to several institutions, hoping they might be performed. Your academy was one of them. But they weren't performed, May said softly, already knowing the answer. No. The professor wrote back saying the works were too experimental and unlikely to appeal to contemporary audiences. Harwell died in 1881, largely unknown. His music was filed away and forgotten. May felt a strange connection to this composer who had lived and died so long ago, whose work had been dismissed just as she had been. Until now, she said with quiet determination, now people will finally hear his music. As the concert date approached, May divided her time between classes, rehearsals with the orchestra, and private practice sessions. The nocturne had become a part of her as familiar as her own heartbeat. Yet each time she played it, she discovered new depths, new possibilities. Professor Chen had taken a renewed interest in her development, offering extra coaching sessions and advice on handling performance pressure. "You've found your voice," he told her during one such session. "Now you need to learn to project it with confidence." The night before the concert, May couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, looking out at the city lights, the leather-bound manuscript open on her lap. Tomorrow, a piece of music that had been silenced for over a century would finally be heard by hundreds of people, and she would be the one to give it voice. "Thank you," she whispered to the yellowed pages, to the composer whose vision had somehow reached across time to find her. "I'll do my best for you." The Riverside Concert Hall was grander than anywhere May had ever performed, a historic building with soaring ceilings, ornate moldings, and perfect acoustics. From backstage, she peeked through a gap in the curtains, watching as the hall filled with people in elegant evening wear, programs in hand. Dr. Powell found her there, already dressed in the simple black gown they had chosen together for the performance. "Nervous?" she asked gently. "Terrified," May admitted with a shaky laugh. "What if I forget the music? What if I can't connect with it the way I did before?" "You won't and you will," Dr. Powell said with certainty. "This piece chose you, May. Trust that." The first half of the concert featured works by well-known American composers, beautifully performed by the orchestra. During intermission, May waited in a small green room, going through her pre-performance routine, stretching her fingers, breathing deeply, visualizing the piece from beginning to end. A knock at the door signaled it was time. A stage manager escorted her through the backstage area to the wings. The orchestra members were already taking their places, adjusting music stands, tuning instruments. Me could feel their curious glances. Most of them were professional musicians with decades of experience. She was a student they'd never heard of until a month ago. Dr. Powell stepped onto the podium to address the audience. Her amplified voice carried backstage. "For our next piece, we have something truly special, recently discovered in the archives of Westfield Academy. Thomas Harwell's Nocturne in a Minor has remained unperformed since it was composed in 1863. Tonight, we present its world premiere, arranged for piano and orchestra by our own Dr. Abrams, and featuring a remarkable young soloist, May Lin." That was her cue. May walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. She made her way to the gleaming grand piano at the center, adjusted the bench, and sat down. The hall fell silent as she placed her hands in her lap and took one final breath. Dr. Powell raised her baton, nodded to May, and the music began. A soft orchestral introduction, strings playing a gentle accompaniment that Dr. Abrams had created based on Harwell's harmonies. Then May's entrance, the simple, haunting melody that had first captured her heart when she discovered the manuscript. As she played, something magical happened. The nervousness fell away. The audience disappeared. Even the orchestra seemed to fade into the background of her awareness. It was just May and the music, having a conversation that transcended time and space. The orchestral arrangement enhanced every emotional shift in the piece. When May reached the passage with the spiral notation, the strings swelled beneath her, building intensity. At the sunburst marking, the orchestra bloomed with warmth, woodwinds and brass joining in a moment of radiance that brought tears to May's eyes. She was no longer playing notes on a page. She was telling a story. sharing a vision that had been waiting over a century to be heard. Her body swayed with the music. Her face reflected every emotional nuance. Anyone watching could see that this wasn't just a performance, it was a communion. As the piece reached its gentle conclusion, May and the orchestra faded to a whisper, the final note hanging in the air like a question mark, or perhaps a promise. For several heartbeats after the music ended, the concert hall remained absolutely silent. Then came a sound like a wave breaking, applause that started softly and grew to a thunderous ovation. People rose to their feet, some wiping tears from their eyes, others calling bravo. Dr. Powell turned to May, gesturing for her to stand and acknowledge the audience. May rose from the piano bench, legs trembling slightly, and bowed. The applause intensified. Dr. Powell shook her hand and then, in an unplanned gesture, pulled her into a quick embrace before turning her back to the audience for another bow. The standing ovation continued for several minutes. May stood there, overwhelmed by the response, trying to take it all in. This moment, this validation of both her talent and Thomas Harwell's forgotten genius, felt like the beginning of something, not an ending. After the concert, the green room filled with well-wishers, orchestra members, critics, music lovers who had been moved by the performance. May found herself at the center of a crowd, accepting congratulations and answering questions about the piece and the composer. "Will you be recording the nocturne?" asked a music journalist. "And what about the other pieces in Harwell's collection? Are there more treasures to be discovered?" "We're planning a complete recording project," Dr. Powell answered, appearing at May's side. "The Riverside has commissioned Miss Lynn to be our artist-in-residence next season, focusing on bringing Harwell's complete works to modern audiences." This was news to May, who turned to Dr. Powell in surprise. The older woman winked at her. "We can discuss the details tomorrow. I think you've earned a moment to enjoy tonight's success." Later, as the crowd thinned and the excitement began to ebb, May found a quiet corner to catch her breath. Professor Chen approached, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. He handed one to her. "Congratulations," he said simply. "You proved me wrong." May looked at him questioningly. "I told you that you played like a well-programmed computer, remember? That you lacked emotion, interpretation." He shook his head ruefully. "I couldn't have been more mistaken. You just needed to find the right music that spoke to your heart." "Thank you for supporting me," May said, "for letting me play the nocturne for my evaluation." "You would have played it with or without my permission," he replied with unexpected insight. "You'd found your voice. Nothing could have silenced it after that." As May drove home that night, the leather-bound manuscript safely tucked in her bag, she thought about the strange journey that had brought her here. From the overlooked student practicing alone at midnight, to a celebrated soloist with a standing ovation still ringing in her ears. But more than the applause or the opportunities ahead, what mattered most was the feeling she'd experienced while playing, that perfect connection between herself, the music, and the audience. For those few transcendent minutes, everyone in that concert hall had been united in something beautiful. They had all finally paid attention, and May Lynn, the girl no one noticed, had found her place in the world, not by changing herself to fit others' expectations, but by staying true to the music that spoke to her soul. In Thomas Harwell's long-forgotten melody, she had discovered not just a composition but a calling. And now together, composer and performer would step out of the shadows and into the light, where they had always belonged.